So as I said, my name's Rob Williams. I think many of you would know me if you've either visited the market or I've spent a fair bit of time in Australia as well. Obviously not recently, unfortunately, but hoping to get back there soon. So yeah, I run the office here in the USA. We have a small dedicated team of four of us covering US, Canada, and Mexico. So I'm just going to take you through the Australian supply situation. Some of this I have covered when I spoke to you last at the Meat Importers Council of America meeting. So I do apologise for those that are receiving this a second time. There have been a few minor updates there, but yeah, it's probably a little bit of repetition for you. But then I'll focus a bit more in on the US and some of the sort of dynamics going on in the US for us currently in the trade. Then my colleagues will certainly pick up more the consumer-facing side and some of the insights where, particularly where MLA is focused on. And for those that don't know, our priorities are certainly grass-fed beef and lamb in this market, as Jason's already elaborated. This is a very important market for us. In excess of 95% of the beef that comes to the US is grass-fed beef or categorised as grass-fed beef. And also, we are a major player in the lamb market here. So today I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction. Then the key areas I'll focus on is the beef production outlook for Australia, the sheep meat production outlook, and then I'll talk about the US market overview. So you can't talk about the production outlook without at least highlighting the weather significantly. So Australia, as you are well aware, is subject to lots of cycles in the climate. Certainly droughts are a significant part of our landscape. But the good news is that at least this year we've seen a fair bit of rain. Now, there are still some areas of Australia that are still challenged in terms of rainfall, particularly in the west and up north. But what you'll see on these maps, on the left, you'll see the sort of the rainfall deciles that have occurred in the first 9 months of this year, and then the outlook on the right-hand side. And I think I said it before, but I've never seen an outlook like that. It was certainly in my few years working in the meat industry. So that's a good news outlook. We do expect a lot of rain in the next 3 months or so, and we are expecting that to be favourable for our producers. And this will have obviously a significant effect on some of the things I'm just about to say next. So let's just take a quick look at the beef production outlook. In terms of some of the key things I just wanted to highlight in terms of beef production outlook, adult cattle slaughter will fall substantially, has fallen substantially in 2020 from 2019, and we project that it will continue to fall, and then we'll look into 2021 in the next few slides. We're also expecting the herd rebuild to be slightly delayed, but it's still on the horizon, especially when you refer back to the climatic map that show we've got significant rainfall coming for Australia. And I hate to highlight this, or certainly our members who are heavily involved in Meat and Livestock Australia are happy with this, that Aussie cattle are actually the most expensive in the world at the moment. And there's a few factors involved in that, not the least being that Australia is entering a significant rebuild phase for both its herd and its flock, as we'll see for the sheep meat production outlook as well. So let's just get into some of the specifics around that. So the national cattle herd has hit a reasonable low of 24.5 million. It's the lowest it's been probably in the last 3 decades, should I say. But the rebuild we think is coming. And so we're certainly projecting a rebuild going into next year. And we're hoping to see the herd hit 25 million, because there was a time there, particularly with the female slaughter percentage, where we were concerned that we were eating too significantly into our herd, which obviously affects your medium to long-term future. In terms of the national cattle slaughter, it's down 15% this year at around that 7 million mark, and we're expecting 2021 to be a low point at 6.9 million. So we have, in our latest cattle projections, which came out in October, we have actually revised that figure down for 2021. So we are expecting a real tightening of supply with the number of heads slaughtered. And probably the key thing is that we've seen a total decline in beef production at 13%. So we're projecting about 4.6 billion pounds to be produced this year, sort of just over 2 million metric tons. And a lot of our beef production is supported by carcass weights that are obviously a bit heavier. So we've had better feed on ground, obviously with the rains, but also we have had a significant number of cattle in the last few years going through feedlots, though that's changed a little bit, that dynamic, as there's the tightening of supply. But we're still expecting our feedlot industry to be quite healthy going into 21. And this was what I highlighted a bit earlier, unfortunately, for some anyway. Our farmers are happy, and certainly the prices have been good for returns on for our farmers, though obviously there's the double-edged sword there of for restockers are also expensive. But in terms of on a world basis, and this is in US dollars live weight, Aussie cattle prices are now we're the most expensive in the world. So let's have a look at a bit around sheep meat production. I guess the key thing here is that we did have a significant depletion in the sheep flock after the drought of 2017 to 2019. That significantly knocked our flock around. And also, we are expecting, a bit like the beef story, we are expecting lamb slaughter to fall. And it will will knock around supply a little bit, particularly in 2020, but we are a bit more optimistic going into 2021 that obviously with the good rain and the shorter cycle of sheep that we'll see some increase actually in production next year. But the other side of that is with the flock rebuild, with the good rains, we're expecting quite a significant decrease in mutton supply. I won't talk a lot about mutton, but I'll happy to answer any questions later on if there's any questions around our supply of mutton. And the same goes for goat meat as well. We won't cover goat meat today, but more than happy to chat around goat meat, given that the US is our largest goat meat market in the world. And the good news also for our sheep meat producers or sheep farmers in general is that the prices are upbeat. They've been a little volatile, and we'll see that in a minute. But the good news is we've got good prices for our farmers, which the flip side of that being that they're more expensive on the demand side. So let's just have a bit of a look at some of the charts around our sheep meat production. So again, our flock is actually at the lowest in a century, so 64 million. Or approximately 64 million. But again, if you look at the chart, particularly to the right with the grey bars looking out to 21 and 22, we are expecting, particularly with the good rains that we're hopefully going to see going into next year, we are expecting a significant flock rebuild. And also we have had some, not only some good prices on the sheep meat side of things, but also on the wool side of things. So hopefully that will continue for our sheep farmers, and we'll see medium to long term a growing flock. Now, in terms of national lamb slaughter, again, coming back to the depletion in the flock, we've also seen a drop in the number of lambs that have been slaughtered this year. We're expecting by the end of 2020 to be at 20.3 million lambs slaughtered. And as for comparison, in like the last 3 or 4 years, we've been seeing above 22 million slaughtered. So that is a significant drop. But we do expect that uptick in 2021, and that's probably hopefully the good news story, that we do expect supplies to be a lot more generous going into 2021, with probably hopefully a lamb slaughter of around 22 million. So in terms of lamb production, obviously with the number of lambs being slaughtered being down, we're also down 3% in terms of our lamb production. We're sitting at just over, well, close to that 1.1 billion pound mark, or about 487,000 metric tons of lamb production. But again, a bit like on the beef story, we've seen carcass weight increases, and they've actually supported our lamb production. So the average lamb carcass now is at about 24 kilos, or closer to 55 pounds. which historically that's quite a high lamb carcass. So again, on the price side of things, there's been a lot of volatility with lamb prices, both in the two key exporting nations of Australia and New Zealand. But again, Australia reasonably expensive in terms of live sheep prices. Again, good for our farmers, but some challenges on the other side when the demand is still quite strong globally. So let's have a bit of a look at the US market and how it sort of breaks down. Now, I'll mainly just cover the metrics and the numbers of what our market looks like, and then Myden and Catherine will pick up a lot more on the details, particularly on the consumer side, what we're seeing there. So just a couple of key points I want to cover on the US market overview. The first thing is that the good news is we're seeing chilled beef and lamb percentages as a percentage of our trade on the rise. Now, of course, that reflects some of the current times. I haven't mentioned COVID yet, but I guess it's pretty hard to get away with not mentioning COVID-19 in a talk these days. But part of that story is the increase in chilled volumes going to retail in the US because of COVID-19. But from an MLA point of view, we actually see that chilled percentage growing as a quasi indicator of premium. So we're happy to see that chilled product increase. And also on the grass-fed beef side of things, you're probably aware Australia is quite a dominant player in the grass-fed beef segment, which is still relatively small in the US. But we are seeing some increasing competition, and I'll just highlight a couple of points on that in the next few minutes. And finally, our Aussie lamb volumes are still very strong to this market. So despite the disruptions of COVID-19, we're actually seeing volumes up again for Australian lamb. And the US, as Jason highlighted, is our second largest export market for sheep meat in the world, but it's also our most valuable lamb export market. So we're very appreciative of the purchases of Australian lamb. I just wanted to give a couple of slides on just economic conditions in the US, or global and economic, because I just think I didn't want it to be too doom and gloom. We've obviously heard a lot about some of the challenges around economies with COVID and the disruptions there. But these are the IMF outlooks for 2021. And as you can see, at either end of the chart, we have Australia at the left end of the chart and the United States at the right end of the chart. But I just wanted to highlight that even though the US is obviously in recession and there's been a knock to GDP this year, the future does look bright. Now, obviously, some of that is contingent on COVID-19 and public health authorities getting that under control. But it's not all bad news in terms of economic growth for 2021. And we have seen, even with the challenges around COVID, a significant opening up in the US in some states in food service. And that is good news because we want to see our food service partners in particular getting back up on their feet as soon as possible. I also wanted to highlight that the reason why the US is so important is because it is still one of the most, it's the largest middle-class accessible market in the world. So now for us, obviously, Europe would be a big market, but there are some restrictions of getting our product into Europe. So we're very thankful that into the US, we do have very favourable market access conditions under our free trade agreement. And for those that are interested, we actually go quota-free in 2022 on beef, and we already are quota-free on lamb. So we're very thankful for that. And that means that the US is still the largest accessible market in the world at 100 million households earning over $35,000 US. Now, of course, the challenges around that is that there are a number of competitors, and we'll get on to that in a minute. So in terms of Australian beef exports to the US, obviously they've taken a bit of a hit this year. We're not naive in the sense of the volumes are down, but I'll unpick this in a minute. You'll see that the volumes are mainly down on certain categories. Now, the thing I wanted to highlight on this chart is that if you see the red line there, we've had a steady and significant increase in the percentage of chilled product coming to this market. So from early 2000s, where it was a very small percentage, less than 5% of our trade, all the way through to the last few years. The chilled trade has been sitting around 25, 26%. It's actually hitting about 29% this year. So we're very very thankful, should I say, of the fact that we're seeing some increases in that chilled trade. And that's obviously mainly reflected in chilled grass-fed product. And again, coming back to the Australian beef export value, the US is one of our largest markets, as already highlighted by Jason. And we've actually seen, despite the challenges in volumes, we've actually seen a growth in the actual value of our trade to the US. So again, looking at the US is a big player, along with Japan, China, and Korea, in our beef trade. And just having a bit of a look at some of the breakdown on the cuts. So this probably doesn't surprise a lot of you. Many of you would be aware, obviously, we've been heavily reliant on the manufacturing trade into the US, and it still makes up about 60% of the volume of our trade. But you'll see it's taken a little bit of a hit this year. It's been probably the product type that's been hit the most in terms of some of the problems we've had, obviously, with food service shutting down during the height of COVID, and also just that sort of gearing up of trying to do things differently. So particular businesses like the McDonald's and the Burger Kings of the world trying to change their business model from a dine-in sort of focus to take out, eat out, curbside, drive-through drive-through capacity. So just having a look at some of the cuts again, just this is a different way of just looking at the year-on-year performance. So if you look at the chart on the left, that gives you again the top cuts by volume to this market. The chart I really wanted to highlight was the one on the right. So the chart there shows there has been some growth in some absolute volumes of some of the cuts. So we've seen some increased volumes of strip loins and ribeyes, so those middle cuts actually coming to the market. Now, obviously, that's been a diversion from a lot of it from food service to retail, but it's still a good news story. And of course, the big drop there, as we can see, has been in the manufacturing beef trade. Now, in looking at US beef imports by origin, this is where there is a bit of a story developing here. So the chart on the left just gives you a bit of an idea of the volumes, the total volumes of imports coming in from all countries around the world. So the US is obviously one of the largest beef importers in the world. That frozen to chilled balance is, starting to favour chilled probably a bit more, but a lot of that is obviously the trade from Canada and Mexico. But the chart I really wanted to highlight was the chart on the right. So what we've seen, the chart on the right, we've still got the four major players in the beef import game in Australia, Canada, Mexico, and New Zealand. And Australia's share of the imports has stayed, relatively the same. So we're bouncing around between 21 and 23% there as a provider of imported beef, and usually sitting the last couple of years anyway behind Canada and even Mexico at the moment. But the key thing to highlight is the growth from the other countries, and that's mainly the South American countries. So Brazil and Argentina, who've just got access in the last year or so. The market share is actually being taken up by South American countries and the Central American countries as well, with Nicaragua. So let's have a quick look at the sheep meat side of things. So our sheep meat exports to the US have been growing year on year. You'll see on this chart, the blue line is the lamb volumes coming to the US. And essentially, since the late, so 2009, we've seen a constant growth in the lamb volume. And that's been impressive despite the disruptions we've had, particularly on COVID and things like that. We've seen a continuous growth. Now, obviously, mutton is a bit more cyclical, and that's we've talked about some of the reasons why the mutton exports might be dropping this year and into next. So again, the story on chilled product. So this is year to date. You'll see the volumes of lamb exports to the US. The reason why 2020 is below the other lines is because the other lines represent the whole year data, whereas the 2020 line represents 2020 year to date to September. But you'll see that that percentage of chilled product is actually increasing. Now, some of that's obviously been brought about by COVID, but it's been interesting that to see that originally our percentages of chilled trade back, going back into the early 2000s in lamb were sort of sitting around 70+%. They've dropped over time to about, well, just recently in the last couple of years, but we are seeing an uptick of the chilled trade this year. I think it's sitting around 57% of our volume at the moment. And again, looking at cut performance in the US, so there's been obviously a couple of cuts that have changed a little bit into the US on lamb, but because our volumes have stayed pretty good, there hasn't really been a significant change, except I'll just highlight a couple of cuts that are really performing quite well. So in terms of, if you look at the chart on the right, this is a similar chart to the beef cuts chart. But the chart on the right gives you an idea of absolute cut performance on volumes year to date to September. And you'll see that legs and shoulders and even the loins have been performing quite strongly. Now, the only negative cut, or the cut that's sort of performed weaker at this time, has been significantly weak, and that's been the shanks. So I guess a lot of shanks were going to food service, and they're harder to repurpose than some of the other cuts. But from a whole of volume and sort of market share point of view, Australia's been performing quite well. And it's I haven't got a lot of charts on how we're performing against our competitors in the lamb space, but I guess it's fair to say Australia continues to be a dominant player in the lamb market in the US, which obviously is a small market, it's a niche market, but we're seeing a slight uptick in consumption of lamb amongst US consumers, and also, as I said, Australian lamb being preferred in terms of in absolute volumes. So just to conclude, I've run through a fair bit there in a fairly short period of time, but probably the couple of key messages that I'd like to leave people with is that supply continues to be tight into 2021, especially for beef. We're expecting it to be a little bit brighter for lamb, but we do expect the volumes to be under pressure for beef production as hopefully the rebuild in the herd takes effect. The other point to emphasise, which I've just talked through a fair bit, is that the chilled grass-fed beef and lamb percentages are on the rise, and that's a significant trend that it may not continue in the next couple of years, but we certainly think that it's probably likely to stay pretty high in terms of the percentages of our trade, and that does give us opportunities, particularly to prioritise and to showcase our premium cuts. And also, a final conclusion is that we think there's opportunities to grow. So just getting back to some of those economic figures, whilst there has been a fair bit of doom and gloom, we do expect the US economy to be quite strong and robust, and we are expecting the US to continue to be an important market for us. And in fact, in the grass-fed beef and lamb sectors, we are predicting the US market, albeit with some connections, will be a grow market. And we'll get into some of those opportunities a bit later on. My colleague Catherine Golding will certainly be able to cover why we think the opportunities are there to grow. So I really thank you for your attention. I thank you for joining us for this trade seminar. And I'd just like to remind you of some of the housekeeping sort of tips that might help you get around the site. So if you're like me, it can be a bit of a challenge sometimes working out all these new platforms, and some of the some of the platforms have some very different ways of doing things. But again, just to remind you, if you look down the left-hand side of your computer screen, you'll see some key tabs there. You'll see the stage tab, which is where you are at the moment. But then also I highlight the meeting area, and that's where there will be a couple of open tables if you just want to jump on a table randomly and see who's around and have a chat with them, or you can jump on a table with MLA or the other speakers as well, particularly later on in the networking sessions. But I also really highlight our exporter showcase. So the tab down the bottom there is the exporter showcase tab, and that's where you will find all of our exporters listed. So if you click on that tab, then you'll be taken to a front page where you'll see a number of our exporters who are showcasing their products. And so I really encourage you to visit the showcase area. And I really encourage you to learn more about the product offerings from our exporters, and also to have direct conversations with our export teams. So again, thank you for your time. We're going to take a networking break now for half an hour. So hopefully that'll give you plenty of time to catch up with those who are here. Also, we will give you a warning bell of when we expect you to come back to the main stage. So we will be back to the main stage at 5:10 US Eastern Standard Time, or 9:10 in the morning Australian time. So thank you for your time, and I encourage you now to network away.